Good day, everyone. Oh, I keep forgetting that there's this new Zoom recording in progress to remind you all that we're recording. G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for joining us. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Australia Institute and host of this webinar series. And thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start by acknowledging that I live in and work on Ngunnawal country and that sovereignty was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. The Australia Institute does these webinars often weekly, sometimes many times a week. This is our second webinar this week, and we do have another one on Friday with the Human Rights Commissioner, Ed Santo. So please check out our website at australiainstitute.org.au to find those dates and to register. And just a few tips before we begin today to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions for our panelists and upvote questions from other people and make comments on them as well. If you could please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, otherwise we'll have to boot you out. We don't do it often, but we will if we have to. And finally, as you got the reminder at the top of this recording, this discussion is being recorded and it'll be posted up on Australia Institute TV on our YouTube channel after this. So in 2017, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, had a major win. Over the course of several years, this group of committed activists had been lobbying countries at the United Nations to move to an international ban on nuclear weapons, and they succeeded, earning themselves the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. The United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the first global agreement to comprehensively outlaw nuclear weapons, and it entered into force in January of this year. It makes nuclear weapons illegal under international law alongside chemical and biological weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions. The treaty is backed by an overwhelming majority of countries. However, nuclear-capable states such as Russia, China, the UK, and the United States haven't backed the treaty, and neither has Australia. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the worldwide total number of nuclear weapons is estimated to be upwards of 13,000, 90% of which are owned by Russia and the United States alone. But this new treaty has put the world on a path towards a future free from nuclear weapons, and the campaign to get countries to sign on to the treaty and begin the process of reducing the number of nuclear weapons has really begun in earnest. And joining us to discuss the treaty today is Sharan Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents more than 200 million workers in more than 163 countries and territories. She might look like a familiar face to many of you. She's the previous president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions from 2000 to 2010, and also served as a member of the governing body of the International Labour Organization. And she also represents a number of international commissions concerning climate action, the industrial transition, and economic reform. I'm also joined by Dr. Helen Durham, who is the Director for International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross. In her role, she oversees a large global network of international lawyers, policy advisors, armed forces delegates, diplomats, and other experts who work towards the respect of international human rights law. And Helen has been inducted into the Victorian Honour Roll of Women and was awarded the Australian Centenary Peacewoman Prize and has been appointed as an officer of the Order of Australia. And last but not least, we have Dr. Marianne Hanson, board member for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons here in Australia. Marianne is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the Uni of Queensland. She's taught and conducted research in international security for more than 30 years and gained her master's and doctoral degrees from Oxford, where she was a lecturer in politics before joining UQ. Between 2000 and 2005, she served on the Australian government's advisory panel on international security. Welcome to all three of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Marianne, the first question I've got is for you. The International Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons is now in force. It obviously has some huge support, and ICAN obviously played a massive role in making this happen. Can you give us a brief rundown of how the campaign was won, what ICAN did, and how we find ourselves at this point in time?
Yes, thank you, Ebony, and hello to all the participants and viewers. ICAN was founded, it stands for International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. ICAN was founded in Melbourne in 2007 by a small group of people, activists, mainly medical practitioners and other professional people. And the idea here was that it was long clear how destructive nuclear weapons are and how catastrophic any use of nuclear weapons would be. One of the problems is that, unlike the other two kinds of weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons and biological weapons, there was no treaty explicitly outlawed the possession and the use of nuclear weapons. And this was a real problem. Added to that was the frustration felt by many, for decades really, many states, many individuals, that the nuclear weapon states, who have all made promises that they were going to move to zero nuclear weapons, have not done so. And in fact, they're doing quite the opposite. They're modernizing and in some cases even increasing their nuclear arsenals. So ICAN was formed to raise awareness about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And it grew as an organization. It actually is now present in over 100 countries, and it has several hundred partner organizations that it works with and has been working with. A decade after it was founded, that was in 2017, when the treaty was achieved in the United Nations and 122 states agreed that this treaty should go ahead. 86 have now signed, by the way. ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I should also add that this is the first time that an Australian-born organization has ever been awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. So it was a major, major turning point, I think. Added to the whole campaign was a view that was gaining ground globally, which focused on the humanitarian implications of nuclear weapons. There were 3 conferences held which examined the likely humanitarian impacts of any nuclear weapon use. And it was it was evidently clear that really these are weapons that were immoral, and it was time to make them illegal. And there are a number of key factors here. The fact that we've had so many accidents, clear calls, near misses of nuclear use, the fact that these weapons could be launched by mistake as well as by design, and the opportunity costs as well. At the moment, the nuclear weapon states are spending $73 billion every year maintaining their nuclear arsenals. So all of this really galvanized ICAN and several other groups. And the end product was the treaty in 2017. But the treaty really is one step, and there's a lot more to do.
Yeah, well, we might get into that in a bit more detail, obviously. But Helen, I want to come to you next. And for those who don't know, could you give us an idea of some of the obligations of the treaty, and also, I guess, reflect on perhaps the change in the way we talk about the treaty and the impact of nuclear weapons in terms of national security or human security, and how that might have changed over time?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning from early morning here in Geneva. It's a great delight to be part of this important discussion. As a starting point, I think we really need to see this treaty as a victory for humanity. And it comes out of a product of many, many thousands of people for many, many years advocating for this. And I think, as was expressed previously by Marianne, it's really exciting, the role that ICAN played. And I also know I'm very proud that the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement has been calling for this treaty for 75 years, since our experience as the first humanitarian organisation on the ground when the horrific weapons were used in Hiroshima. So, as was noted, this treaty entered into force in January 2021. It currently has 86 signatures, so that means 86 states have signed up to it, and 54 states have ratified. That means 54 states have really committed it into either domestic law or really made it real. Now, why is this treaty exciting? I think because, as was mentioned previously, is the first time we have a comprehensive articulation that the use of nuclear weapons is illegal under international law, and in particular international humanitarian law, which is often known as the law of war. Now, what this treaty does, it's a fairly short treaty. I spend my life dealing with these treaties, and often they're very long. This has 10 operative paragraphs, so to speak. And the first one is very clear. It says that every state must undertake never to develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire, or stockpile nuclear weapons. So a very comprehensive list of things that can't be done. I think it's also very, very important. And this is why this is a formidable treaty, I must say, on the international legal landscape. But there's a particular article about the requirement to assist victims and to remedy environmental damage done, particularly around testing. And I think whilst I'm a other part of the world, my heart very much sits in Australia and the region, and we know the humanitarian impact, the horrific humanitarian impact of the testing of nuclear weapons. So I think having both the prohibitions, the requirements not to transfer these weapons, the requirements for the states that do possess these weapons to actually ensure that they, at a certain deadline, make sure they destroy these weapons, it's a very comprehensive piece of obligation. So I think that's a really important element. As was previously mentioned, I think what kicked the process over from the many extraordinary activities that civil society and some states had taken for decades, and I want to particularly here note the role that women's groups have played, and I'm sure we'll hear more of that from Sharan. But I think what kicked it over was the discussion that the fact that these should not be located and thought about as making us more secure as humanity. And in fact, it was a lot of work that the UN and the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement did, along with ICAN, to identify that for the biggest humanitarian organisations in the world, we would have no capacity to respond if these weapons were used. Either directly or indirectly with an accident, as was noted. So when there was clear evidence that there was no response to the way that the humanitarian impacts would occur if these weapons were used, it was very clear that you had to shift the discourse to, well, if you can't respond to something, you have to prevent it. And so the 3 meetings that were held globally really drove home that message that we cannot think about these weapons as some sort of benevolent way that balances the world, but in fact, they're catastrophic. There is no response and we need to eradicate them. So that's just in a nutshell what the treaty, key elements of what the treaty requires, the non-use, the non-testing, the non-developing, eradication, and also the requirement to take responsibility for the impact, particularly around testing.
Thank you so much. Sharan, I might come to you next. We've talked a little bit about the treaty itself and the campaign to get here. We'll maybe go into some more details in a minute, but I wanted to ask you kind of where we go from here.
So first of all, let me say hello. It's fantastic, as Helen said in our pre-discussion, to hear Australian accents and to see the banner of the Australia Institute and know that it's still going strong. So thank you, Ebony. And to be on a panel with 2 amazing women, Marianne and Helen, it's a treat. However, we have a lot of work to do, you know. The movement's done an incredible amount of work. And as Helen says, the achievement of the treaty was, far beyond what anybody had dreamed about at the outset of ICAN. But it is here. We now have to promote it. We have to make sure it's ratified. And we, of course, have to put pressure on to see it implemented. But I wanted to say that the treaty gives us a license to now look not just to weapons, but to look at what beyond weapons and disarmament we will require for our common security. We need disarmament. We need the world to shift its thinking, but we also need a new social contract with people that gives them the hope that actually takes away a lot of the preconditions for war and, of course, the destructive nature of war for humanity and the environment. And I wanted to remind us today that almost 40 years ago, the concept of common security was created by an international commission headed by the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme. Tragically, the quest for common security is as relevant today as it was then. It still requires a way of thinking in a world characterised by the arms race and increasing tensions between the superpowers, that indeed this situation is and could still lead us to nuclear war, resulting in the extinction of humanity. I mean, Palmer argued, of course, that a nuclear war cannot be won and would be disastrous for all parties. We know that. Somebody put in the chat, what do you think about the concept of mutually agreed destruction? Well, I think we all know that that is just something that is unacceptable. Nobody can win a nuclear war. And so if you look at the situation today, that indeed in many ways it was similar to the situation 40 years ago. Yes, we have a strong movement. Yes, we have the treaty, but tensions between the nuclear powers are rising. And indeed, military spending is also rising, and nuclear arsenals are being upgraded. This is despite the fact that everybody knows that we cannot continue on this path. So I would just say, Ebony, it's time once again to highlight the principle of common security and persuade those in control of weapons of mass destruction to actually initiate disarmament and to create mechanisms that reduce the likelihood of devastating war. I would say that indeed with the TPNW, you know, we need to really look at how we actually promote its acceptance, its ratification, and indeed implementation. It's come into force, but NATO's opposition, for example, is unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. And by the way, we don't believe there's anything that prevents a member of NATO signing or implementing the treaty. And I know Marianne and Helen would have a lot more to say about that. But if you look at the increase of arsenals around the world, this is really unacceptable on three fronts. One, it's a frightening resort to actually build more military power. But secondly, in a world post-pandemic with pre-existing crisis of historic levels of inequality and indeed the climate crisis, to spend this kind of money on armaments, full stop, and the CIPRI figures just recently are frightening, is absolutely unacceptable when we need to spend it on the fundamentals of a social contract that actually help us build, both in terms of people and the planet, a common security.
Yeah, it gives us a lot to kind of reflect on about how much work there still is to do. It's a really good point. Helen, I'll come back to you in a second to pick up Sharon's point there about, you know, some of those nuclear states and the states missing from this. But Marianne, first back to you and back to Australia. Australia originally signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which came into effect in 1970, but we're not signed up to this new treaty. What is the issue that Australia has, and what are the prospects for Australia signing up, in your opinion? Oh, hang on, Marianne, you're on mute there. Can you just unmute yourself?
Beg your pardon.
There we go.
Yep. The first thing I point out is it's not that Australians are opposed to the treaty. It is that this current government is opposed to the treaty. Regular polling has shown that well over 70% of Australians support the abolition of nuclear weapons. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. There is a groundswell of support, and it's something that I think is growing. But why won't the current government sign? basically they have come up with a set of objections which don't really, I don't think they can be sustained. The main three arguments that have been put forward is that signing the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons would go against the ANZUS alliance, that it would clash with the non-proliferation treaty that you mentioned. And the other argument is that, well, the nuclear weapons states haven't signed, so, we're not going to go along with that. All of those supposed arguments, justifications, misunderstand the nature of the treaty and the whole issue that, politics is the art of the possible. We can do this. We have outlawed inhumane weapons in the past. Now, the ANZUS alliance is not a nuclear alliance. That really has to be spelled out. It never has been a nuclear alliance. Nonetheless, successive Australian governments have claimed that they sit under the US's nuclear umbrella. There have been a number of studies, including from the Harvard Human Rights Law School, which have said that it's quite okay for Australia to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that does not clash with our obligations under the ANZUS Treaty. However, we would have to renounce any reliance on nuclear weapons, and we would have to disentangle ourselves from the provisions that we currently give to the US government at Pine Gap and elsewhere. So we'd have to separate out the nuclear and the non-nuclear facilities there. Now, that is a complex issue and it's a difficult issue, but it can be done. It can be done. It's political will that is the problem here. The TPNW, far from conflicting with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is actually a natural product of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which requires all states to negotiate in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. So there is nothing incompatible with the TPNW and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then finally, the argument that, well, the nuclear weapon states haven't signed and they're not going to sign soon. The issue is this: the treaty is a very important delegitimization of nuclear weapons. It's a clear legal ruling that shows that these weapons are immoral and that they would violate international humanitarian law in the extreme. Previously, history has shown that if we want to get rid of a particular inhumane weapon, whether that be chemical weapons, biological weapons, landmines, it's a three-stage process. You stigmatize the weapon, you delegitimize the weapon, you have a legal ruling in place, and this is what we do have as of the 22nd of January this year. And over a period of time after that, you can push and push for elimination. Once you've got the treaty, then you can apply further pressure on the state. You can put in place divestment strategies. You can do quite a lot, really. So it's a very important step. And the idea, of course, or the hope is that in time, the nuclear weapon states will come on board, that they will agree to move to full disarmament and they will commit themselves to this. But as I said, it isn't true that Australia as such is against the treaty. Indeed, ICAN has a strong and growing cross-party parliamentary friends of the treaty group in Canberra. And there are a number of parliamentarians from around Australia who are very supportive of the treaty and of ICAN's work. We've had 35 city councils sign up to the city's appeal, basically endorsing the need to abolish nuclear weapons. And we see large numbers of people, healthcare workers, faith-based leaders, academics, youth movements, etc., supporting this. So it is the government which is the obstacle.
Thank you. I don't think it's would be any shock to Australians to find that our current government is using the excuse of other nations in action as an excuse not to do anything. We're quite familiar with that in the climate change space. Helen, I might come back to you though on that idea of the states that are missing from this treaty at the moment and what kind of pressure an international treaty like this now with a number of signatories, how will that eventually, do you hope, contribute to more countries signing on, particularly nuclear states?
Well, thank you, Ebony. I think it's a really critical question, and it's one a lot asked, and not just on this treaty, but I would say on many of the disarmament treaties, and I would say international law and law as a whole. You know, it's great, you've got this treaty, it's the first step in a very long journey, like it is indeed, as we're all saying, the very first start, but it gives us a framework, it gives us a capacity, and allows us to set ourselves in a direction of where humanity needs to go. But this is lovely. The virtuous, those without them will sign it up, everyone will feel good and it won't have any impact. Well, if you look back through history of every single disarmament treaty, whether it be the obviously the often well-known landmine ones, blinding laser weapons, the arms trade treaty, nuclear weapons go into this category of you do not see those who possess as the first signatures. That is something we're very, very used to. And something like the International Committee of the Red Cross, with our role as the guardian of international humanitarian law, we've for 150 years seen, exactly as Marianne spelt out beautifully, you need to set a pathway. And if I can just give it in a very basic example, you do not usually have smokers that sign up first to anti-smoking policies. You know, I mean, I know it sounds silly and we can't correlate something as big as nuclear weapons with smoking, but it's human nature. I mean, it's very clear with the non-proliferation treaty, as mentioned by Marianne, one of the big arguments globally, and particularly by P5 or powerful states, many of the big states that have the nuclear weapons capacity, that this is going to erode the existing legal normative framework, particularly around the non-proliferation treaty. I think it's really important that we loudly say, and I'll be even a little bit more detailed, Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty requires states that possess nuclear weapons to, in essence, I'm summarising, to pull back, to start disarming. Now, therefore, this new treaty is complementary. They reinforce each other. And to start slicing up and saying they're against each other doesn't make any either legal, ethical or humanitarian sense, but it's just not logical. So I think from certainly many organisations, the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, and I do know, for example, Australian Red Cross does some amazing work, partnering often with ICAN, often doing their other work separately to raise this issue. I think there is an ease. It's expected that those who have the most to lose from a change will perhaps be those that are least interested, but it's very, very important that we start somewhere. We build up the momentum. We stigmatise, as Marianne says. You start getting companies. You know, the day the treaty entered into force, you've got superannuation companies. You've got those who manufacture these weapons starting to look very carefully at the economic implications that such a treaty plays. You've got the capacity to put events like this together. We've got the reason to talk about nuclear weapons again at a wider level, because I think it had been lost in the psyche of many people. Either it was too scary, it was too big, or it was too old. It was something that happened a long time ago. And I think there's something around this terrible pandemic that we're all struggling with, that is exacerbating pre-existing inequalities, that has reminded people that some of these big issues like nuclear weapons cannot be dealt by one state alone. They're a global issue. There has to be a global impact. I know myself attending that all the meetings that were held internationally on this issue, the sense when you saw groupings of states, the African group saying, a small number of states possess these, but if they're utilised, we are all impacted. How do we have a more democratic voice about how we reflect upon human security globally? So I think it needs to be an ease about the fact that not everyone's going to sign up at once. Not everyone's going to agree that this is the best step forward. But if we know our history well, we know that it does have an impact over time. Law never revolutionises human behaviour, sadly, but it does give us a framework. It gives us the capacity to move forward. It gives us tools And I mean, I have no doubt, I hope it's within my lifetime, but I have no doubt that this will be a pivotal shift in the future of the way it goes. We just have to be patient. I always say with being an international lawyer, you have to be persistent, you have to be passionate, but you also have to be patient. But that also needs a degree of energy and younger people to pick it up and say, it's unacceptable that, that we have these weapons in existence. So yes, there'll be states that will not sign up. There'll be states that argue this is not the best pathway out of the challenge that we face with the existence of these weapons. But I think we have to hold very strong as those who believe there is a future in ensuring that we don't live under the daily threat of nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Sharan, I'll come to you next, and then we'll go, I think, to questions from the audience. But obviously, the trade union movement is one of the most powerful movements in the world, with a long history on a range of issues, including this. I'm just struck there by the various comments from the panelists about the importance of kind of peace building as opposed to warmongering. I wonder if you could just reflect on the role of trade unions in this movement, and as well as, you know, women's groups and others, and how that really does impact on the momentum and achieving things like a treaty, and where it could take us from here.
Well, I think Marianne and Helen have already commented on the fact that we wouldn't have this treaty, probably the NPT either, if we actually didn't have people and the movement of people for peace across all spheres. If you want a couple of examples going back many decades, then let me first of all pay tribute to my own trade union history. I grew up in the New South Wales Teachers Federation, and indeed peace was always on the agenda. It was always on the agenda. There were, you know, magnificent leaders like Sam Lewis who were, you know, set the framework for why teachers had a responsibility for peace and peace education, and more broadly, peace building. But then if you look at ICAN, you know, the Australian trade unionists were always pushing the international movement around ICAN. And we were just as proud, Marianne, to see that Nobel Peace Prize, because so many trade unionists are proud members and activists within ICAN. But if you go to origins of things like the women's groups, you know, Helen alluded to it, but the destructive nature of testing, you know, women have always been there to support, again, that notion of community, common security, an end to the impact. And again, in my own history, from indeed a teacher activist through now to, you know, a global trade union leader, then it's always been Japan who's been our conscience. We talk about the Japanese as our kind of peace conscience. They've never let us, and they shouldn't, and we shouldn't forget the devastation of the nuclear bombs, obviously. And we were sad to miss, you know, in person, that amazing kind of uprising last year at the 70th anniversary. But we know that the women there, for example, I would go out in Japan walking with the women who would hand out handkerchiefs or, you know, a table runner or some small thing that actually had never again will we actually put our children's lives at risk, or similar messages. So we're trying to now do the same thing again, because we see very clearly the rising tensions in the world, and they're no longer just the superpowers. I mean, they'll be in there somewhere, but the geopolitics in almost every region. And we've just seen 11 days of devastation in Palestine and Israel. And again, while there weren't nuclear weapons involved, the threat is always there in that part of the world, just as it is everywhere else. But the tragedy of the human cost, we can't build a world that we want as working people for our families if there's no underlying condition for peace. So the treaties are critical, but it is the women's movement, it is the trade unions, it is civil society generally, it's the conscience of the International Peace Bureau and ICAN. In fact, we've re-established several years ago now a partnership with the International Peace Bureau. It's the oldest peace movement in the world. And we promoted one of our newly retired leaders, Phil Jennings, and, you know, twisted his arm to become a co-chair of the movement, because we think that the intergenerational conversations that we have to have now around peace, our common security, a new social contract. We can't build a new social contract that's about jobs and rights and universal social protection and equality of income, gender and race, an inclusive world based on the SDGs or the Paris Climate Agreement. Can't do any of that if you don't have the preconditions for peace, and they're entwined. So that's when I say we want to return to the sense of what is, how do you inject our common security into the movement. So yes, I'm very proud globally in every country of the trade unions, but can we do more? Yes. And frankly, you know, we've had to rethink the intersection between demands for things like the new social contract, inclusion and peace. And hopefully we are increasingly acting on that from a global level, as well as continuing to support movements at the national level, but we can't do it alone. So with amazing organisations like ICAN, the IPB, the absolute strength of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, you know, everybody needs to be thinking about what it takes. And we will see more and more wars if we don't actually deal with climate, whether it's war, energy, water, food wars, land wars. We're seeing them now. People aren't really paying attention, but the tensions are there. And I saw in the chat, you know, somebody who has a view common to the hearts of trade unions, particularly given the impact of the pre-existing crisis and then the pandemic. But if you think that military expenditure has topped out at the moment at 1,981 billion, imagine that as a golden bridge to health, education, you know, a commitment for those in need to basic income and our common welfare. So, you know, it doesn't make sense for trade unions not to be at the helm of this. And of course, because I'm talking to Australians, then you have to pay tribute to our Indigenous communities who know the impact firsthand of testing, and the Pacific Islanders. And again, remember those magnificent, you know, the stand in defence of the Pacific Islands and Islanders. I have to say, you know, we were proud to be part of that as a movement.
Thanks, Sharan. We might go to questions from the audience now. We've got a number here, so just a reminder that you can type the questions in and I can see them here. So the first one I have is from Thomas Pagano. He says, what are the chances in practice of uneven enforcement of the treaty? In other words, could this become a tool for controlling the behaviour of a country like Iran, but leaving countries like Israel, the US and Russia unaffected? Helen, do you want to take that one first?
Yes, and I also saw there was a question, a sort of technical question in the chat about the time frame for those states who are required to destroy their existing treaty. So I'm sorry, their existing weapons. So I'll put them together.
Yeah, thank you.
I think what's really important is for a really clarity of understanding is that this treaty is only binding on those states that sign up and then ratify. So I think, and sadly, this is the nature of international law. You know, sovereign states can decide which treaties they want to sign themselves up to. I only say sadly, because of course these things are very exciting. We want them to be universal, but there is still the importance of state sovereignty, and states need to decide what they will or won't do until things move on forward and become customary law, but that's another story. So in relation to when a state has to, that owns or possesses or control nuclear weapons, Article 4.2 of the treaty is very clear to say that they should, on signing or ratifying up to the treaty, immediately remove these weapons from operational status and then destroy them as soon as possible, but no later than a deadline that's going to be determined by the first meeting of state parties. So that first meeting of state parties will be very important. It's coming up. It happens a year after the treaty enters into force. But those states that decide to bind themselves to it are under that time frame. So with that in mind, I think, sadly, like most things in life that both have a good aim, they can, of course, be instrumentalized. However, I think when a state themselves can decide whether they want to bind themselves to the obligation, I think it's less likely to be, as the question was asked, instrumentalized in that way. Now, international law and international politics always have a strong relationship, but I think it is really important that we explain to people what the treaty actually requires. I think then states are able to, when we put it in a broader conversation, make these decisions. I also, just on this sort of technical matter, I think it was really important what Marianne said about the interoperability. You know, states that might want to sign up or ratify a treaty, but also be in relationships with other states that possess them. We have over the years always dealt with what we call this interoperability issue. Countries have signed up not to use landmines, but still done military exercises with countries that do use landmines, for example. Nothing is unimaginable. Everything can be resolved. It's not always easy. I think we have to understand these areas are complicated, but I'm not, the thing that keeps me awake at night is not the worry that it might be instrumentalized about states, but that states move forward with the good understanding and the willingness to implement their obligations and actually sign up, ratify up, and start the steps that are required to give us a nuclear-free future.
Thank you. The next question is from David Noonan. He says, regarding what Australia will do if the ALP wins office in the next federal election, I might direct this one to you, Marianne. Do you expect the ALP will sign up to the treaty or hold an inquiry, such as the Canberra Commission 2 inquiry, as provided for in the national platform? And I guess a question around what does this mean for US bases in Australia, such as Pine Gap?
Well, we were very pleased that at the Labor conference, there was a commitment made when Labor is in government to sign the treaty. Now, yes, they did put in place a few caveats, but I think all of those are ones that we can address, or that not just ICAN, but other experts and specialists can address. As I mentioned earlier, it will require us to disentangle ourselves from some of the activities that are happening in the joint facilities at the moment. And we're also likely to make the US very annoyed. But at the end of the day, I don't think that the US will walk away from the ANZUS alliance. The ANZUS alliance can continue as an alliance based not on nuclear weapons, but on conventional weapons, which is what it is in any case. So yes, there will be some changes that will need to be made, but we are confident that we can address all of those challenges, and we will expect Labor to uphold its commitment.
Thank you. The next question that I've got is from Bernie McComb, who says, if nuclear weapons become extinct, doesn't that mean the demise of civilian nuclear, especially nuclear power? Does anyone want to comment on that? Marianne?
I can do, yes. The short answer is no. No, not at all. In fact, nuclear power is something that is widely used in many countries, many countries. Now, there are arguments against nuclear power and the risks that come with that, but that's a separate issue here. In fact, the Non-Proliferation Treaty agrees that all states have the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So this is the key here. Now, peaceful purposes can sometimes be diverted to weapons purposes, but that is why we have the IAEA, which has strengthened safeguards and strengthened inspections. So just to answer the question very briefly, eliminating nuclear weapons does not mean that nuclear power cannot still continue for those states that want to use it.
Thank
Can
you
I
so much.
say,
Yeah.
Ebony, can I say, as an individual, I would say, well, that would be a great thing if it did, frankly, because the continued mining of uranium, the use of nuclear power is leaving generations of toxic waste. And we are nowhere near the promise of the safety of fusion and so on that we've all grown up with. So I don't want to start a debate about nuclear power, but from a personal point of view, if I can just put my hat over here, then, and I think the majority of Australians are opposed to nuclear power, or they were certainly when I was there in a full-time capacity. But can I just address a couple of other things about
Go for
the
it.
question about politics? Because I saw in the chat that, you know, it is so important that we have governments who are respectful of what Australian people want, and not just at the ballot box. And if we're going to see stable democracies, then we need to make sure that the democratic rights and principles of engagement are there. One of the things that has to be a priority for any progressive government is, or any government it should be, but is, I saw a rightful comment that you can't just pay tribute to Indigenous people. I totally agree. I'm totally supportive of a treaty. I can't believe we don't have a treaty with Indigenous people. I cannot believe that they still have to go through, you know, incredible struggles to get people to help them defend their lands from intrusion, whether it's mining or, you know, terrible destructions of ancient sites, or, you know, whatever it is that the Indigenous people do not want intruding on their way of life, which most Australians don't want either. So I think, again, that sense of common security starts with, are we really committed to democratic rights and principles for everybody? And anyone who thinks democracy is not at risk, take a look at the statistics. Less than 50% of the world's people now live in democracies. Many young people, up to 45% of young people, have never seen a democracy dividend. And so they actually are not committed to democracy, don't really believe it's a robust system that they can trust. That's a recipe for disaster. And we can't do anything about implementation of the treaties if we don't have strong democracies, and if we're not beating back the rise of the far right, and indeed the spectrum of authoritarianism, even within democratic states. So, you know, people have to have the respect of being engaged in their democracies, and we elect our politicians to listen, not to be sanctimonious in governing in their own, you know, in their own eyes. So I think if we're going to deal with, yes, ratification of the treaties, but implementation, then we need to remember that we have to have a different way of thinking about our common security and not about individual defence capacity. Otherwise, it's not people that win. It's actually, you know, the terrible kind of legitimacy of the military companies.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. And Sharan mentioned there, obviously, the huge role that Aboriginal communities have played in this movement, defending their country, but also with that legacy of nuclear testing here in our own country. And I will just note, in terms of winning peace prizes, that the Uluru Statement from the Heart was awarded the Sydney Peace Prize today on Sorry Day. So it's really exciting to see renewed, I guess, awareness and interest and momentum for making sure that that statement from the heart, asking all Australians really to come into a process to work towards a voice to Parliament, treaty and truth telling. I think that'll be such a huge thing. So congratulations to everyone who worked on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I will just finish up. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So I think we've got 1 or 2 questions to go. I've got 2, I think, related questions here from Dan Monceau. He says, how did the concept of international relations get so tangled up with the belief of the so-called nuclear umbrella? And the other question was really, I guess, about the defence sector changing its messaging. I'm not sure if he's reflecting here, particularly in Australia, in its recruitment drives and promoting, adventure and training opportunities as the reasons to join up to the Defence Force. And I guess here in Australia, we've also seen public servants, ministers, backbenchers really banging the drums of warning about war with China and that kind of thing. I wonder if the panel could reflect there on whether or not the peace movement needs to be changing its messaging to bring more young people in, and how we kind of push back against that warmongering, banging the drums of war rhetoric that we're seeing much more of, certainly here domestically in Australia. Helen, do you want to take that one first?
Certainly. Thanks very much. I mean, I think more generally, because the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, of course, we advocate as strongly as we can for peace. But in our role in the ICRC, our aim is to, when there is an armed conflict, to make sure there's a limitation of the suffering. So there's many profound issues you've raised there that I'm not in a position to address. But what I would say, particularly about young people, is that I think we often underestimate, when we have good, exciting programs, how important young people see these issues. And I mean, I think Marianne explained at the start how ICAN was created, and I think it was a fantastic example. I mean, you see the really vibrant things that ICAN does with a lot of young people's energy. I know a number of years ago, Australian Red Cross did a campaign online, a digital campaign, where I think it was over 1 million mostly young people, but others signed and engaged in that. So I think, and if I just may say for a moment, I mean, even in my role as Director of Law and Policy here, we have internships here in Geneva. We get up to 400 to 500 young people applying for one internship. So I think this idea that the young people have lost their way and aren't interested in these things, as Sharan said, often it's because they're not exposed, they don't know, and of course that relates then to people not, if you don't have an understanding or a hope. If you don't have hope, and I think there's a lot of information in the media that we absorb about how terrible things are, but don't provide solutions, don't provide pathways out to move forward. So I think it's really important to connect nuclear weapons up with issues such as the environment. I think you cannot care for the environment and at the same time think that having weapons that could destroy the environment is okay. So I think there's a lot of ways we can find clever bridges, as Sharan and others mentioned, clever connections, and move this forward, because we are in an extraordinary situation as humans on the planet. There's no planet B, as they always say, and we have an obligation to look at what are the steps we can take, and particularly, as I said, from my perspective, around these weapons issues, what is acceptable and what is inhumane to be used during times of armed conflict. So yes, let's find those connections, let's educate, let's engage, let's give some hope, let's give some solutions, and let's locate the reality, the dangers of where we are in a place that can also give people the sense that there's something they can do about it. And I think that's sort of, in one way, is the sort of the message that this treaty is as well. A lot of people said over the last many decades, we're never going to get a treaty, and I think we've got one. So now that we've got one, we need to build upon that and take the next step and then the next step. So it's incremental, but incredibly important.
Marianne, did you want to add to that? Sharan? Yep.
Young people are the key. There's no doubt about that. The energy, the commitment, as opposed to their disillusionment on democracy, their commitment to issues that are climate, peace, support of people, etc., is extraordinary. And I'm a great champion of intergenerational conversations, because if you listen to what young people want, and then they in turn listen to the stories of older warriors for the movements of peace, then it's extraordinary the bonding that goes on. I mean, I was so proud to see our Australian students again out on the streets in climate just last week. And, you know, we have to include young people. Now we have to find a way to do that. So we're not just inviting them in to our territory, but actually sharing the storytelling and the plans for a common future with them. Building them with them, I meant.
Yeah, Marianne, did you want to add anything to that?
Absolutely, I endorse that completely. The issue is this: what kind of a world do we want to live in? What kind of a world do we want our children to live in? Now, I teach hundreds of undergraduates here at the University of Queensland, and I have detected in the past 3 or 4 years a growing sense of despair that governments are not listening. Governments are not taking seriously the issues that are going to be affecting young people much more than they're going to be affecting us. So I think, you know, there has to be, as Sharan mentioned, a better responsiveness on the part of our governments to focus on what matters. And I don't think that increasing our defence spending is an answer to any of the problems that we're currently facing, least of all climate change or COVID or the housing crisis, etc. So it's really important. And I can say that there are now many, many young people who are involved in ICAN and other groups. And so that's really heartening. That is the way forwards.
We've only got a couple of minutes, so I might just ask you all to reflect in a minute, just very briefly. I think we've talked a lot about a lot of the problems in the world, about the disillusionment that we have, but it really strikes me that as you've all talked about, this is such a huge achievement. Many people said it couldn't be done. So are you all hopeful for the future now that we've got this treaty, and where do you think we're going in the next, say, 5 years? Marianne, if I can start with you. I think you're on mute there. That's all right. Helen, maybe I'll come to you.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, back to Marianne.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, computer problems. I'm hopeful, absolutely. I have to say that, you know, for 75 years, there has been horror at the impacts of nuclear weapons. And the numbers of these weapons have just gone up so much. We saw around 70,000 of them in the 1980s. Now we have around 13,500, 14,000. And I think that's a very depressing thing, but there is such a strong movement now. There's such an awareness, especially of the humanitarian implications, and there is a demand for change. So I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist.
Thank you. Sharan, I'll come to you next.
Well, you have to be optimistic. And today we have our Global General Council. And indeed, we will listen to and develop solidarity plans with people on the front lines of conflict against the coup in Myanmar, on the streets of Colombia. Our leaders are jailed in Hong Kong. And so on it goes. You know, there's about 7 serious political struggles today that are about defending democracy, but they're people being attacked with guns and, you know, and other military weapons. And so you have to be hopeful with that level of courage of people to defend something so dear as democracy. You will never have democracy if, forgive me, there are men in charge of nuclear arsenals. So the women's movement's never been more important. The youth movement's never been more important. The trade unions, from my perspective, if we really want common security, have never been more important. And I salute the 2 women who are extraordinary leaders of our times who are here today. Well, 3 actually, Ebony.
Thank you. And finally to you, Helen, to take us out.
Thank you very much. And yes, I mean, I think women leadership has been historically a critical element of many of the important disarmament treaties. And as Sharan and Marianne have said, even wider. I think you have to, for anyone listening, beamed in on this, for anyone thinking about it, you have to have an element in your heart of hopefulness and optimism, because I love that saying, and it's really important one to me. You know, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. And I think there is a lot of darkness out there. I think this treaty is a thin candle in a big, vast darkness, but you know that a candle can light other candles, and you know that moving it forward, and I think particularly if you have young people, if you have a diverse group of people, Indigenous communities, civil society, and politicians and members of the military. I mean, I think, you know, humans as you know, encompassed as the diversity that we are, lighting more and more small T candles, we will push back against the darkness. So I think that it's dangerous to overestimate what a treaty will do. It's merely an agreement. It's a starting point. But I really hold on to it. And I mean, like Sharan and Marianne, I spent a lot of my professional life in the sense of darkness. I mean, my operational work when I go into the field, going to war zones, going to places of detention. So it's not a naivety. It's not a sense that everything's perfect, but there is a sense that we have the capacity, if we move forward together intelligently, to make it much, much lighter out there for many more people.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up on that hopeful note. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today. Please help me congratulate Sharan Burrow, Dr. Helen Durham, and Dr. Marianne Hanson. And thank you all for your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't make it to all of them. Just a quick reminder, we have one more webinar this week on Friday. We'll be talking to the Human Rights Commissioner, Ed Santo, as well as Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch, and Pete Lewis, the Director of the Australia Institute Centre for Responsible Technology. That's at 1 o'clock on Friday. You can find those details on our website. And next week, we'll be taking a break. 3 webinars this week, none next week. So we'll be back in touch with you there. But you can find all recordings of our webinars on Australia Institute TV at our YouTube channel. And don't forget to check out our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And once again, thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for joining us for such a fantastic and important discussion today. We really appreciate it. Stay safe out there, everyone. Stay hopeful, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.